Okay, everybody see the presentation? Great, okay. So what I want to talk to you today about, and just making sure, there we go, okay, is, in the world of media, as many of us are small business owners, consultants, there are opportunities to get your story told, and you can tell your story through a lot of different mediums, okay? And I'm going to touch on that briefly. I'm going to share with you how the world has changed in terms of journalistic reporting during the age of COVID-19. And then we're going to end the presentation with an opportunity for you to pitch me a story. So that's going to be very interesting and an interactive exercise, which will lead to then potentially doing some pro bono work for folks who are interested. Okay? So if you've been watching the news, it's hard not to watch the news. You've probably seen some of these headlines, and it is basically, in summary, coronavirus all day, all night, all week. And for publicists whose job it is to tell the stories of quickly growing companies as well as nonprofit organizations who are trying to get their good deeds visible, increase their profile, and generate valuable exposure, it's a very challenging time because you've got to pick your spot with respect to telling a story that has something to do with the virus. And as we've seen in, well, I don't know how long we're into this, it's certainly over a month, there are positive stories and then there are negative stories, right? And you see some of these headlines right here. One, screaming Mike Pence criticized for not wearing coronavirus mask at Mayo Clinic tour. That was driving the news cycle this week. But at the same time, there are really interesting stories being told. The one directly above that appeared in the Wall Street Journal. The secret group of scientists and billionaires push for a project for COVID-19. It actually is being referred to as a Manhattan Project-like initiative, and it was a very good reporting exclusively done by the Wall Street Journal and how they're influencing public policy decisions with respect to developing a virus to treat, a therapy to treat the virus. And so now I want to share with you kind of the world that all of us business owners can view generating exposure for our organizations. How many of you are either familiar with this diagram or an acronym PESO, P-E-S-O?
Nope.
Okay, I can only see 3 people on my screen at the moment. So you unmute if you want to comment at this point. Okay.
I'm not aware of it.
First time seeing it.
Neither am I.
Same for me, unaware of it.
Okay. So this is a diagram that helps explain the options that are available for business owners to distribute and share their news. And I'll just walk you through this briefly. Paid is pretty straightforward. It's the category that more people are familiar with. It's sponsorship and advertising. So basically, you pay a media outlet, whether it's Facebook, the Philly.com, or your trade publication, to tell the story, your organization's story, in the manner in which you want to tell it, the timing in which you want to deliver it, and you have absolute control over the outcome, okay? So the upside is you have control. The downside is you're paying for that exposure. That also includes, incidentally, sponsorship at events. So whether you're a nonprofit or whether you are a Small business owner, we obviously, Beacon is supported by sponsorship from members, and some members choose to get exposure in front of the membership vis-a-vis sponsoring events, as well as the website and other media tools that Beacon makes available. The next category is owned, and owned is basically what refers to the media platforms that you control that are free. Okay, so these include your website, your newsletter, and if you look at that diagram there, they go into some specific other areas: employee stories, customer stories, user-generated content. And by the way, the owned all these categories can vary the descriptions based upon the organization using it. So the idea behind owned is you get the benefit of paid media in that you can control the content, the creation of the content, the distribution of the content, but then you start relinquishing some of the outcome of that content. And so once it gets in the hands of the user, they can, be sharing it on social media and so forth, which takes us to the next category, which is shared. And that is principally your social media accounts. And so what you'll see here is, I'm going kind of counterclockwise on this diagram, is you go from maximum control gradually around to no control. And I'll explain why that's important in a second. So in shared media, you're originating the content and then you're sharing it with your followers on all those various platforms. Then they can start weighing in real time, as everybody knows. So you can get negative comments, positive comments. Things can go viral in a positive fashion. Things can go viral in a negative fashion. So you really lose control over the outcome of the content. Now, if you then rotate all the way to the top, we go to the fourth category, which is earned media. And that is my specialty. And earned media, the term came around, I would say, probably 5 years ago, maybe a little earlier than that. But basically, it refers to publicity. And the primary delivery tool for that is media relations, working with journalists. But also, in recent years, as influencers have risen in prominence as a vehicle to get your news, your story out, influencers are now part of the earned media category. Now, what does earned mean? Earned simply means that you have to earn the buy-in of an independent third-party expert to tell your story. So in pure media relations terminology, that just means you're pitching journalists, and the journalists have to determine, or will determine, whether or not your content, your story, meets the threshold for newsworthiness. And hold on to that thought for a minute or two, because we're going to get into what is newsworthy in a second. So you have in PESO, paid, earned, shared, owned, various options at your disposal, each with different strengths and weaknesses. So to summarize, bring it all together, paid, you have maximum control. You have to pay for the visibility, but you also have the least credible media to deliver your story. Anybody take a guess why that is?
Because you can put anything out there you like, and unless somebody wants to take the time to fact check you, it's your perspective.
That's exactly right. And take that a step further, is the audience, your target audience, recognizes that you are paying to deliver that message. So the notion that you had to pay to deliver that content is instantly understood and recognized by the audience, because if it's an advertisement, you know it's an advertisement, right? And incidentally, lines are starting to blur and have been blurring over the last couple of years, where earned and paid have merged a little bit. And I think you see that with the idea behind this graphic in what's called sponsored content. And this becomes very deceptive in that you'll be reading your favorite trade magazine, or it might be Inc. magazine, for instance, where it looks and feels like a journalistic story, but either at the very top or at the very bottom of the article, it'll say sponsored by. And unless you're really scrutinizing it, you'll think that a journalist or somebody at the magazine wrote it. And that incidentally goes for digital as well. If you look at Philly.com, you'll see, maybe a third of the articles on there say sponsored content. So you got to be very careful if you're, a consumer, who is driving that narrative. Okay. So earned, you have the trade-off is the highest credibility because third parties are telling your story. Okay. Whether that's industry relations with your trade group, or whether that's an influencer or a traditional journalist. The downside is you have almost no control. And so when we counsel clients, we counsel them through these 4 sectors. Where are you most comfortable, number one? Where are your assets and the strengths of your leadership team with respect to delivering your narrative through these 4 buckets, if you will? And then from a holistic marketing communications perspective, you have to ask yourself the question of, do we have, quite frankly, enough money to drive content through all of these areas? Do we have the in-house resources to drive content through these areas? And do we have content that's appropriate for all 4 of these areas? Okay. Any questions before I leave this slide? Great.
Tony, you may be this is Maria. You may be planning to get into this, so if so, that's fine. We can defer the question. But given the size of the businesses that those of us who are on this call have, are there recommendations on where you suggest that we put our energy? Because of, I think to your point of the earned media, that's always been a challenge to find something that's newsworthy. So I guess I'm just wondering, is there a direction that you would suggest for us who have the smaller businesses and may be challenged to find that newsworthiness for a story?
Maria, thanks for the question. It's a good one. The answer might surprise you. There's no easy answer because it depends on what the organization does. So let's assume for a minute you're a very small operation. Let's just say a 1-person self-employed solo practitioner consultant, right? In the owned category, that's typically where you're going to start your building your narrative and your content to be distributed to customers, prospects, and centers of influence, right? So because everybody needs a website, right? Not everybody, but typically almost all organizations have an e-newsletter that they distribute to their database. So you typically start there, and from a cost perspective, it is probably the cheapest to get off the ground, unless of course you're hiring consultants to design a website. You could certainly use templates that digital marketing companies provide. I don't recommend that because they look cheap. Shared media, okay, very similar in that sense that it doesn't cost anything to set up a Facebook page for your business or a Twitter account. So distributing your content through a shared platform is also cost effective. So typically very small organizations will begin with both of those content areas. So paid, then you get into budgeting. What kind of budget do I want to create for sponsorship? And as I noted earlier, there are sponsors that keep Beacon running. So clearly, members find value in sponsoring different communication channels through Beacon. I think where you may have been heading, if I'm putting on my crystal ball, is can small organizations afford an earned media initiative? And the answer is yes. It just depends on the scope of the activity. You can be focused on one story per month or one story per quarter, one media outlet. When you work with publicists, they will coach and advise you on the potential reach of your story, and then calibrate a budget to get that out. So if you look at earned versus paid, it's interesting because, and sometimes I'm asked this question, which is, okay, if it's free, right? It's because you're not paying for the space to tell your story. The media outlets are telling a story for you. What's it going to cost me? Well, you're paying a public relations consultant to, number one, guide you through the process, develop your narrative, and then importantly, connect you with their contacts. And that's principally what publicists offer. That is the value add. And typically why they're hired is they have a network of media contacts that they can open doors for you to have your story told. The other thing is some organizations, particularly startups, think they can do this. And the challenge is, yes, there are distribution tools such as PR Newswire or any paid newswire to send out a press release. But typically they don't reach journalists. They're just put on the web. So the value of working with a publicist is they already have those vested relationships with the journalists that get you the real earned media, not just distributing content online. That might have been a long-winded answer, but did I get there?
You did, yes, thank you.
Okay, terrific. Anybody else? Terrific. Okay, so now we're going to break down some of these categories in a little more detail. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about paid media. Does anybody recognize this guy? If you've been around for a while, this name might look familiar.
I remember the Crass brothers. I don't know who that guy is, though.
Yeah, there you go. That's Mr. Crass. And not to be too cute, but his advertising campaigns, and I'm talking back in the 70s and 80s, so you may not remember that, was probably the most, dare I say, crass example of advertising there ever was. This guy was on TV all the time in Philadelphia. And his commercials were outlandish and they were in your face. But you know what? You always associated Crass Brothers with these advertisements and you associated it with their brand, which was Store of the Stars. And that was his tagline, right? He says, here, if you didn't buy your suit at Crass Brothers, you was robbed, right? And that was just the tone that this advertising campaign took, but it was particularly effective. And going back to that diagram, the fact that you can control advertising, this is a great example because this guy was a nutcase, okay? But he could deliver his crazy TV ad campaign anywhere he wanted, and principally that was through the network affiliates in the Philadelphia market. So maybe after the presentation, you'll hop over to YouTube and check out some of his commercials. They're absolutely hysterical.
And remember, the other one was Crazy Eddie, not in Philly, but in New York was
That's
Crazy
right.
Eddie.
Yeah.
Was that
His
electronic
prices
store?
are insane.
Insane.
There you go. There you go.
Cool.
So now flipping to the other extreme, earned media, as I mentioned earlier, the key here is any organization, whether you're engaging a publicist or not, you have to get to the level, I call it the hurdle, of being newsworthy. And the interesting thing about the qualification for newsworthiness is you don't determine that. And some of the most successful entrepreneurs and CEOs that I've worked with over my career often don't get it. They never get comfortable with that because they think that they've got the greatest story in the world, and they're going to tell the media that they should write about them. Well, no. The notion of being an independent media is that they determine for their audience whether your content, your story, your narrative, whatever you're doing right now is newsworthy. So to help you appreciate that, I'm sharing a quote directly from Diane Mastrol, a good friend of mine. She used to be the commercial real estate reporter for the Inquirer. She's now a general business writer. You might see her doing small business stories on Mondays, and she's also has picked up the weekend editor beat. And she says, I'll just read this to you. By insisting that something is newsworthy because it exists, such as an apartment complex, is not necessarily news. But if the pitch is accompanied by research showing a profound lack of rental housing in a region, it would have felt less like a pitch and more likely been covered and been a legitimate story. Okay, so let me just expand on that a little bit. What she's saying here is, don't give me your owned or paid media pitch, right? Which is why we're great. Tell me why there's a story there for a general readership of a newspaper, a daily newspaper in Philadelphia. And in order for it to be newsworthy for that audience, she is suggesting that your apartment community, why your development is interesting, is because you've added research showing that there's a lack of rental housing. Okay, that provides the ballast or the foundation for your pitch about your company. You're backing it up with data and statistics that suggests that what you're doing has real meaning and is in current events for their reporting. Does that make sense to everybody? And this is just it's one journalist, but it's a universal example that you can apply to any media outlet. So whether it's CNBC, whether it's the Inquirers we're talking about now, or whether, let's say you work in the pharmaceutical biotech space. We do a lot of that, a lot of work in that sector. Pharmaceutical Executive is a very influential trade magazine for pharmaceutical companies. Same thing. You just take the principle here and you apply it to any journalist anywhere, and it will work for you. Okay. So now, with regard to earned media, we talked a little bit earlier about the strengths and weaknesses of all four categories. There was an interesting study conducted last year, 2019, by, and I'll get you this source in 1 second. I think it was the Institute for Public Relations. And it's a nonprofit organization, and they did a study of all of those four media quadrants that we were looking at. And the study, which I provided a link to there, I'm not sure if you can link to it from this presentation, but the presentation I think will be available afterwards. Will take you to the study, and the key takeaway is that participants in the study found that earned media is the most credible among all sources. So we went over the the various types of media, and I did that deliberately to set the stage to help understand the role of earned media and its value proposition. Participants value journalists' independence above all else. Also, incidentally, they included in that category bloggers, so long as bloggers, industry bloggers, do not require compensation, okay? So this is one of the things, as a side note, if you're trying to do this on your own and you want to connect with influencers in your industry, or you want to connect with bloggers in your industry that really have some pull, you have to ask them up front, do they require remuneration? Because if they do, first things first, I'll tell you, is that reduces immediately their credibility. Okay, so they're asking you for a pay-for-play relationship, and I would call that into question in terms of their credibility. And it's not always the case. There are influencers in every industry sector who just are going around the world test driving products, and they're sharing their findings with their audience. Okay. Now, let's get into what's going on right now with the news with the coronavirus. A lot of companies are making headlines. Here's one example, Shake Shack. Did everybody see what happened with this business? Very profound. Now, we're not going to get in, for the purposes of this discussion, into what were they genuine in their motives? No, we're going to be talking just about from a PR perspective here. And for those that don't know the whole picture here, just a little context. I think everybody here pretty sophisticated operators, so I don't need to go into deep dive. But a lot of big businesses, including public companies, 180 public companies, in fact, took money from the payroll protection program. Part of it was the infrastructure that wasn't in place to really scrutinize this process to make sure that small companies got it. The other is, quite frankly, just the speed at which the SBA had to stand up the program, that there were just loopholes. And of course, influential companies had lobbyists and people of influence in important places. Now, however, Shake Shack was the first to recognize the PR implication of what they did. And they moved quickly to send the money back, and not just send the money back. They didn't do it quietly. They went loud with their story. And what happened? They got a ton of positive publicity. And what's more is their move pressured their competitors, such as Ruth Chris, who got all the negative publicity, to give their money back. And then a lot more other businesses gave their money back. But this is an example of what's driving the news cycle right now during the coronavirus. This specifically was on the payroll protection program.
Tony, in this case, I'm with you on how they got positive publicity, but I don't understand how they get positive publicity when, they broke the rules, applied for the money, and took the money, lobbied, whatever. They got the money. How is it that it's positive just because they were first? And is that the spin there that a publicist kind of helps with, or I don't know, or people just stupid?
No, well, let me respond to the thrust of your question to reframe your thinking a little bit. It's about perception. Okay, so when you say how could it be positive, the public's perception is Shake Shack did the right thing after they realized they made the mistake. You may not think that, but a lot of the public does.
After they realized that they applied for the money, which they should. Anyway, I'm with you.
You see, that's where I was trying to avoid us going. You're getting a value question about whether they should or shouldn't have. Their public statement on that was that the rules did not preclude them from doing it, number one, and number two, that they had no idea of how the virus was going to ultimately impact the business down the road. And so they took advantage of the program. So it's not a moral question. It's just they did what they did, and they were the first to recognize that they had to give the money back. Okay. And you know, I didn't intend for the slide to be a debate on, how much neutral, positive, or negative publicity they got, but generally speaking, it was positive in the view of the public. Here's another example, and this is closer to home. Okay, so this is very interesting. So a lot of us are small business owners, right? This is Steel City Coffee. It's a very popular cafe and music venue in Phoenixville. And they have been all over the news. I think the Philadelphia Business Journal has done 3 stories on this small business in just 30 days, okay? They have made a concerted effort to get their story out to the local media outlets. And it's been on a range of issues. It's been, how do we keep our doors open? How are we taking care of our employees? How is the PPP working or not working for us? Everything they experienced moving through the closure of their business, and then the trying to remain viable and alive through this process, became fodder for storytelling. So if you search on Google Steel City Coffee Phoenixville, you won't see it on the all response page, but if you go to the news tab, you'll see a number of articles that the press have been writing about them. Now, what's the value here? If we remember the 4 quadrants, right, and we specifically look at earned media, the value proposition is independent third parties are telling your story and they're giving you credibility, okay, that what you're doing is sufficiently newsworthy and interesting to the public. So I'm guessing, I don't know this woman who's the owner, but I'm guessing that she took a very active and proactive position, that she wanted to get her story about what they were doing, how they were helping employees, how they were giving back to the community, out to the media. And she wanted to leverage the media to get exposure for her company, so that they, number one, the community would continually to remember that they were doing good in their community, number one, and that when the lockdown is removed, that built up positive feeling for this small business is going to result in, number one, retaining their customers, that their customers will come back, number one, and number two, attracting more customers. And it's also a music venue, by the way. I've been there to see a couple concerts. It's a very cool place in Phoenixville. Now, so let's, after we see a couple of examples there, let's transition now to applying this to your organizations. How to stay visible while being sensitive. I have sensitive there, but I could have easily replaced that with sensible. Now is not the time to be spinning stories about how great you are, okay? Even if you have come out with a new product, like I have a client in Pittsburgh that is a biotech laboratory creating custom formulations of CBD or cannabinoid ingredients for large consumer brands. They're doing some really innovative stuff right now, and they're launching new products. They're going to have a drone, for instance, that has a special sanitizer that's going to be able to go over stadiums very shortly. And we're going to roll out that new product and probably get some good publicity. But the idea here is that when you're thinking about what am I doing right now that might be newsworthy, you've got to be sensitive to the time. And the time is that it's a public health crisis. And you can't be viewed as being insensitive capitalizing on people's woes, right? Being callous. You've got to be sensitive to, is first and foremost a public health crisis, secondly, an economic crisis. And that's difficult. And one of the challenges in this environment, getting your story told, as we saw on the first slide, everything is coronavirus all day, is something called the news hole. Now, I'm going to just guess here that my audience doesn't know what the news hole is, but if you surprise me, I'll be impressed. Anybody? Okay, so the news hole is a publicist term that refers to the size of the opportunity to get a diverse array of news stories placed in the media. So it's just a reference to the fact that if this news cycle is being driven by one subject, and this is probably in my, I think I've been in this business 28 years, probably the most extraordinary situation I've ever been in, and without parallel, quite frankly, in that so much coverage by every media outlet is so heavily weighted to the virus that the news hole, the opportunity to tell other stories, is very small. Secondly, if you're out there touting a new product, how great it is, and you're touting it to your local media outlets, be careful that it doesn't backfire on you. You know, I had a reminder of myself a week ago as I was putting out a new hire, two new hire stories for one of my clients. I had to ratchet back my follow-up, my engagement with the press. So wait a second. The fact that a company just hired 2 executives is not a big deal right now. So you know what? I'm going to let that lay. You know, the email has been delivered to the journalists. They'll get to it when they get to it, but I'm not going to badger them. And so even someone experienced like myself has to remind themselves, be sensitive to the time. Okay. Now, one way to be very sensitive and very effective as an organization to get your story told is with thought leadership. Now, I suspect that the audience probably has heard the term thought leadership, but I'm guessing may not fully understand what it's all about. Is that safe to say? Get a couple head nods there. Okay. So thought leadership, what that refers to is being a voice of information for your community and your industry to help explain what's going on in current events. Okay. The gentleman in this image is a great example. John Challenger is the founder, chairman of Challenger Gray and Christmas. And if you've recognized that name, they have been a leader in generating useful information about industry trends and employment. So he and his subject matter experts are all over the news right now. Why? Because they have found a way to get through that small news hole by providing data and research on unemployment. Who's hiring, who's laying off, who's furloughing. And this brand has been probably in the job placement industry the most effective at doing that type of PR for as long as I can remember. So he is a go-to source for Fox Business, CNBC, Bloomberg TV, for instance. Whenever there are job numbers coming out of the Labor Department, they call them. I mean, they don't even have to put out a press release, although they do. And they have a very robust content generation program. And they do their own independent research, not just commenting on Department of Labor statistics. But they have established themselves with thought leadership to be a go-to source on employment issues. So I'll just touch on some of these bullet points here. It's about establishing leadership and tapping your leadership within your organization. I recognize that a lot of us are very small organizations, but you may have clients who may have interest in this. It's about not saying how great you are, but providing insights, perspective, and illuminating current events. Right now, we're talking about a health and economic crisis. So Mr. Challenger is on there, on TV, talking about who's laying off and who's hiring, what industries are ramping up hiring, where you can go for those jobs, how to transition your skill set, etc. It's about being a statesman or a stateswoman, okay? By not being promotional, by talking to issues in the industry, not about your company. And subject matter experts. I'm sure you've heard about subject matter experts. Subject matter experts are individuals within organizations that have expertise in the topics of their industry. You can look to subject matter experts, tap their knowledge, and provide their perspective and their insights directly to journalists in your industry and beat reporters who cover your industry in the local media. So, you know, we're very parochial here in Philadelphia, and our audiences may be local. So in that case, we're talking the Philadelphia Business Journal, we're talking the Philadelphia Inquirer, and we're talking probably your county newspaper. And then it is also a very effective PR tool, not just in a time of crisis, but ongoing. And we do something called contributorships. I've provided a link there. Hopefully you can click through it. And contributorships are basically thought leadership in the digital age. And I'll just address that real quick, is that because so many media outlets in every industry sector have now very robust publishing platforms online, they're looking to thought leaders within their respective industries to provide ongoing columns, anywhere from 400 words in length to 1,000 words in length, on a monthly basis on very specific expertise, right? So, for instance, if you are, you know, I'm looking for a good example. Let's assume that you have a web portal for job placement, okay? You know, you could opine on the type of applications that are being processed through your platform and what your algorithm is tracking as far as data. You can easily convert that into articles that you can suggest to your industry publications to have published. And lastly, educate. Educate, educate, don't sell. So when I mentioned that funny term, news hole, this is not a silver bullet, but probably the most effective way to get through that small news hole, because the fundamental principle of thought leadership is you're talking to what's happening in the world today. You're not talking about your company.
Hey, Tony, I have a question here. It's Jory. So my organization is a special education school, and we consider ourselves a thought leader in our space. And clearly, John Challenger is a thought leader in the space of placement and layoffs and transition support for people who are laid off, and all those services they provide. We are actually in the unique situation of wanting to pitch.
And so is Beacon, by the way.
So is Beacon, correct. So my school is in a unique position of doing something that's out of the ordinary during this time of coronavirus. We think we're doing something that's above and beyond, and I'll save the rest of this for the, you know, maybe the end when you open up for a pitch. But I guess my question is, can you be a thought leader like this guy John Challenger is, or like maybe the CEO of the Pathway School is, and tell a story on behalf of the industry when clearly you're also trying to get your organization some exposure in the process, what your organization is doing that is in your mind newsworthy?
Yes, with caveats. To parrot back the question, what Jory is asking is, if the nature of thought leadership is to tone down the self-promotion, why we're great, can we get a benefit for our brand for the visibility if what we're doing is really addressing industry concerns, trends, issues, developments, etc.? The answer is yes. In the old days, I encourage you all to click that contributorship. We called it byline to articles. And basically, the agreement between the media outlet and the subject matter expert is you're going to add value to our audience by helping to explain what's going on in this industry and what the industry needs to know. So if you take education, for instance, right now there's a lot of issues going on with distance learning. There's a lot of issues going on for students with high anxiety and being separated from their friends. There's a whole range of issues, whole range of topics that are potentially fodder for contributed sources. So it's not going to be as overt as if you were releasing a new product and the press is just covering a new product, or you've acquired a company and they're going to talk about the transaction and how the companies are coming together. It's going to be a little more subtle, and that's the trade-off. So your name and your organization will obviously be at the bottom of the article, and the implicit notion is that you, by your expertise talking to these issues, that you're an organization of value. Now, to get more granular, in individual articles, for instance, or in this case with TV broadcast, can you get across a message about specifically what you're doing? You can, but you have to be very careful. If we were to take percentages, if you had 30 seconds on Fox Business, which is probably all you'll have, or maybe a minute, 10 seconds to cite something specific that you're doing really well, because otherwise you're going to overwhelm, you're going to weight the PR too much about what you're doing and not about what your peers need to know in the industry, or what your prospective customers need to know in the industry. So it is an agreement, it's an understanding that there's a certain protocol, and public relations consultants will frame the story and prep the client in a way that you get a percentage of what we're doing now in the press, but also to respect the value of providing the thought leadership in the first place. Does that answer your question, Jory?
Yes, it does. Thanks, Tony.
You bet. Are there any other questions on this topic of thought leadership? Okay, terrific. All right, so what we've all been waiting for, right? Everybody recognizes that face. And if you're going to go pitch Shark Tank, you better have your pitch down, because Mark Cuban is going to slice and dice you, fillet you. So in preparing this webinar, I thought, well, I just don't want to put a static, here's what you need to know, but also make it a little interactive and fun, quite frankly. So I call it Shark Tank for PR, workshopping your pitch. And so the three questions really are what I would encourage everybody to think about. Number one, do you have something to say? What the heck does that mean? As basic as that question is, it's remarkable I have found how many organizations don't have anything to say. In other words, they just want to be covered positively, but they don't have any insight to provide their industry. Okay, so when I say, do you have something to say, it's a idea that you have the willingness and the inclination to engage journalists, but also something intelligent that adds value to their reporting. Number two, how are you helping out? As we said, sensitive time. The best way to get a story told is, what are you doing to help your community right now? And we can say community in the broad sense, in the global sense, not just locally, but your community being your industry, your peers, etc. One of the nice things that's come out of this horrible situation is the benevolence of organizations large and small. And to tie the two slides together, this one and the one before it, a friend of mine who is more of a branding guy, his name's Peter Madden, been friends with him a long time. He's got an agency downtown. He secured a very good contributorship program with the Philadelphia Business Journal. He's in every week, online and print. And even though he's a branding guy, he's not talking about branding. He pitched the Philadelphia Business Journal, hey, can I provide a perspective every week on how we're making do? You know, and I sent an email to him the first time I saw his article come out. I applauded him. I said, you know what, for a sales guy, that was courageous and good for you to, you know, pitch a contributorship where you're not talking about your business at all. Okay, he is capitalizing on the value of his benevolence of just writing articles about how we're all making do, business owners, moms, dads, etc. And I thought it was very notable and laudable. So what are you doing to help out? Could that be newsworthy? What impact have you made? I'll give you an example. My cousin is a designer of custom jewelry, wedding bands, necklaces, rings, etc., out in Seattle. And it's just beautiful work that she does. Literally, her business came to a screeching halt in like 48 hours. All of her sales are online, and they just stopped. And after a period of shock, and she, you know, recentered herself and got her balance back, she said, okay, well, nothing I can do right now about my business. So she did what a lot of retail, whether it's e-commerce or bricks and mortar retail did, is apply for aid, do the best she can. But then she said, you know what, I'm wildly creative. What can I do with my creativity? So she opened up an online store of sorts for making custom-made masks for people. And she's pumped out hundreds of these masks. She's designing them herself. Many are doing that, but that's what she felt she could do to help out her community. And so when you talk about, you know, what impact have you made? Well, you know, in her case, she gave back to the community by creating masks where there was a shortfall of masks. And specifically, she hooked up with an underserved and at-risk population, which is Native American communities. And she's working with reservations in northwestern part of the country to provide them with masks. So now you have a newsworthy story. So let's talk about that real quick. Small business owner impacted, business shuts down, pivots, decides she's going to do good with her skill set. And while many are doing masks, right, because the media is going to ask, as I will ask, okay, how is yours different? What she did is she connected with an underserved, at-risk population. Why are Native Americans at risk because they have underlying health issues that COVID-19 attacks. So the fact that she's making these masks for a very specific population provides a very specific news hook for, she lives in this case, Seattle, the Seattle Times, and her craft industry. So I'm going to be working with her to develop a pitch and get it out to her media outlets. So that's an example, tangible example of somebody who's gone through this process, thinks they have a story, and obviously I'm doing it out of benevolence as well because I'm helping her out. Hopefully that visibility will endear her to her customer base, but also to others who may not be familiar with her business. And when the doors open back up, her business will increase.
Beacon is the premier executive networking organization serving the Mid-Atlantic region. To learn more, go to beaconforlife.org.